bloody, violent history. You get a bit of this.
They stuck their heads on pikes.
You get a bit of this.
They're in their own little bubble, their own little violent world.
It tells us who we are.
If you see these ships and they come on the land, you're to hand the men over.
Forget the handing them over, they were slaughtered.
How we got here.
It's not in the DNA or on the hard wiring of military officers to turn on their commander-in-chief, but there was an understanding that the only person who could get rid of Hitler was going to be a military man, and that's why the plot started focusing on active measures, how to rub him out.
And perhaps where we're heading.
He fired their heads from the cannons on the ramparts of Burgoo and Sengli and fired them back into the enemy lines.
My name is Tom Ashton, and I'm here with my old friend James Jackson to tell you about our podcast, Bloody Violent History. For myself, I was a soldier in my 20s, and for the last 2 decades I ran my own cigar and coffee business in London. In our coffee shop we had a large round table, scene of many interesting conversations, not least about history and what came before. The table itself has a backstory in that it belonged to my grandfather, Sir Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris, a key commander during World War II. As for my co-host, James Jackson, he is a best-selling historical thriller writer, author of the Counter-Terrorist Handbook, and someone who's worked with the likes of Guy Ritchie and Frederick Forsyth. And Jamie, didn't you appear in one of Forsyth's books as the heroic Colonel Jackson?
I think I did, Tom. I always knew I'd be big in books one day. I just didn't realise it'd be one of his, but it was extremely flattering.
I've actually read that book, and Colonel Jackson cuts a fine figure.
Yes, as someone who's blind, I always wondered whether there'd be an action figure doll that had a white cane and a pistol. I'm waiting for that one to hit the market.
OK, that's a bit about us. The mission statement for this podcast, what is it, Jamie?
It's really to tell a story, to create a narrative, to give people some sense of their hinterland, their background, where they came from, where their nation came from, and the sort of complexities of current events put in the context of a wider perspective, a historical perspective. And I think it's extremely important. You know, it was Cicero who said that if you don't know history, you're condemned to being a child for the rest of your life. And maybe he was predicting the appearance of infantilized wokes 2,000 years before they actually arrived. And also, as Churchill said, that in order to deal with the future, you somehow have to know something of the past. And he of all people, would know that.
Yes, Andrew Roberts made that point in his book about Churchill, that he was very well prepared. Churchill was well prepared for his role in the Second World War as a wartime leader because he had to write the biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, and the Duke of Marlborough had to deal with many different nations and leaders, and it was a coalition.
Well, as I said, it gives some sort of perspective. I think one of the problems with modern politicians is that they are so short-termist, and that leads to all manner of problems and all manner of mistakes. And you can go through the list. It's absolutely staggering. You look at Afghanistan today. If people had taken lessons from the 19th century, they would have known that no Pashtun tribes are going to accept commands from a centralized Tajik, Uzbek-dominated government in Kabul. If you look at the problems in Iraq, anyone who had seen the issues that arose over putting Germany back together after the Second World War would have appreciated that you don't dismantle the entire country. It's easy to win a war. It's much harder to win the peace. And again, look at Russia. It's extraordinary that I produced a book, Cold Cut, in 1999, the autumn of 1999, warning about the appearance of a KGB-dominated, KGB-sourced president who returned Russia to its Stalinist past. And it came out just at a time as Putin's KGB cronies were blowing up apartment blocks in Moscow in order to make him look like the tough man and give him an excuse to start airstrikes against Chechnya. And because everyone at the time thought, oh, Russia's lost the Cold War, Russia's heading for liberal democracy and market capitalism. No one was aware of the black cash and the black ops that were flooding into Western Europe and America. So it's a question of learning, of looking at the past, of gaining a wider view, a greater perspective. And history has that function, history has that role. And this is really what the podcasts are about. It's trying to give a flavour and give some sort of flesh to the bones of the past. And otherwise we lose a lot in not knowing that.
And maybe then we can stop making these terrible mistakes.
Well, I think we'll always go on making mistakes. Churchill made mistakes. He was a man of his time, and you can't make any sort of decision with occasionally cocking it up. But you can have a longer view. You can see the mistakes of the past and try and avoid them. I've always said that history is a bit like a fault line, and eruptions occur every few years. And the best thing to do is try and trace and track those fault lines so that you're not surprised when they do erupt.
On this podcast, we're going to tackle the big subjects, including a vast array of topics: crusades, cavalry charges, Nazis, narco-warriors, and 20th century heroines.
Yes, and I think it's important, Tom. I always think it's a bit like going to see HMS Victory. And once you've done that, you can start reading around the subject. You can look at Nelson's Navy, and not just Trafalgar. You can look at Pitt the Younger. You can look at longitude. You can look at all the issues of the day. And that makes it a far more fascinating subject rather than being boxed into a corner or boxed into a particular period, which is how history is so often taught today. The point of the podcast is to reach across not just the divide, but the whole span of history, and cover a hell of a lot of subjects.
The range of this production is going to be from moments in the recorded past up to the current time. So our podcast will embrace gunpowder to gun running, crossbows to crosshairs. Okay, folks, I hope that gives you a clue as to what we're about and whets your appetite for our podcast and, of course, the past. This is Tom
and Jamie
signing off for now from Bloody Violent History.